The October morning fog clung tightly around Long's Peak, the most treacherous summit in Rocky Mountain National Park, Colorado. In the dim dawn light, the massive granite face loomed like a cold gray wall, majestic yet menacing. Locals in Estespark called it the unforgiving giant. 3 years ago, 2 young climbers, Daniel Bauer and Miles Hatcher, vanished on that very mountain. Their campsite was found tidy, food untouched, sleeping bags still rolled. No signs of a struggle, no bodies, no explanation. For 3 long years, Emily Bauer never stopped hoping to find her brother. But the mountains stayed silent, as if they had swallowed him whole. Until one autumn morning, when a dog's frantic barking broke the quiet over a rockslide field in Rocky Mountain, and a trembling 911 call stirred the entire town awake again. What really happened on Long's Peak 3 years ago? Where did they go? And why was only one of them found? The answers, when they finally surfaced, would leave all of Estes Park shuddering. Estes Park, Colorado. A small mountain town nestled beneath the towering Rockies, where sharp-roofed wooden cabins lined the quiet main street, and chimney smoke curled into the brisk morning air. Emily Bauer stood at her kitchen window, staring at the distant peaks at Long's Peak itself, its granite face catching the first light of day. It had been 3 years since her brother Daniel vanished on that mountain, and still she swore it watched her back cold, indifferent. 3 years earlier, Daniel Bauer and his best friend Miles Hatcher set out to conquer Long's Peak via the infamous Keyhole route, a narrow, wind-whipped line of rock and ice that had claimed many before them. That night, they sent Emily one last text. "Don't worry. Just 2 days. We'll be back Sunday night. Promise." But Sunday night came, and no one came back. By Monday, Daniel's phone went straight to voicemail. So did Miles's. Emily drove to the Rocky Mountain Ranger Station, tears blurring her vision as she explained everything she knew. The next morning, search teams began combing the trails. They found the campsite neat, undisturbed. The tent pitched, backpacks stacked, food untouched, climbing ropes neatly coiled, as if they'd stepped out just for a moment and never returned. No blood, no tracks, no answers. Time passed. The news cycle moved on. People in town stopped asking. Only Emily kept searching. She kept Daniel's room exactly as he'd left it, his climbing shoes lined up by the door, his chalk bag and route journal tucked into a cedar box beneath the bed. She still hung his missing flyers on bulletin boards at the grocery store, the post office, the climbing shop. People started to look at her with pity or worse, avoidance. That morning, her phone rang while she was pouring coffee. Emily. A deep, familiar voice. Sheriff John Kessler, the same man who'd led the search 3 years ago. Yes. This is she. What is it? I need you to come down to the ranger station. We found someone. His voice faltered on the last word as though saying it out loud was cruel. Emily's hand went numb. The mug slipped through her fingers, shattering on the floor. She couldn't remember driving to the station, only the flash of patrol lights reflecting off the rocks, the yellow crime scene tape strung across the Keyhole trailhead, and the forensic techs in white suits stooped over something just beyond the boulder field. A young deputy led her to the command table. There it was, a weather-faded blue jacket, torn at the shoulder, a waterlogged wallet, inside a driver's license bearing a familiar grin. Miles Hatcher. Emily bit her lip, hard-tasting blood. Sheriff Kessler stood behind her, his heavy hand on her shoulder. His voice was low, almost ashamed. "We haven't found Daniel yet. But we're not done. Trust me on that." Emily clutched the ID card in her fist, her gaze drifting back up to that cold gray mountain. For the first time in 3 years, it felt like an enemy. Somewhere up there, her brother was still waiting, and she swore to herself, "You won't have to wait through another winter, Daniel." That evening, the pale autumn sunlight slipped behind Long's Peak, leaving its jagged face cast in a cold bronze shadow. The mountain range loomed darker now, the boulder field where Miles's body was found, swallowed by a creeping dusk. Wind cut through the gullies, lifting fine dust into the air like smoke. Emily stood still among the rocks, watching as investigators methodically combed each crevice. Cameras flashed, pencils scratched across maps. Nobody spoke much. Every unnecessary sound felt almost disrespectful in the presence of what had been lost here. She couldn't look at the yellow tarp for long. From a distance, it was just a strip of fabric stretched over the body, stark and lonely among the stones. The coroner's team eventually lifted the gurney, carrying it toward the trailhead with slow, deliberate steps. Emily turned her head, but the image stayed burned into her mind. From higher up the trail, the steady clop of hooves echoed off the rocks. A man on horseback emerged from the ridge, his silhouette tall and imposing beneath a beige Stetson. A string of cattle followed him languidly, their breath rising in pale clouds against the chill. Emily barely glanced at first, but she noticed him hesitate at the sight of the scene below. His gaze swept over the yellow tape and the gathered investigators, as though measuring something in silence. He rode down toward the boulder field, stopped briefly by the tarp, exchanged a few quiet words with a uniformed officer, and then steered his horse away. She heard someone murmur his name in the wind, Vernon Hartley, and she made sure to remember it. She didn't know why, but as his eyes met hers, for the briefest moment they carried something heavy, something cold. Then he tipped his hat and moved on the sound of hooves fading into the mountain's hush. Night fell quicker than she expected. By the time she returned to her cabin on the edge of town, darkness had swallowed the road, leaving only the warm glow of restaurant signs and shop windows flickering like dying embers. Emily sat at her kitchen table staring at Miles's water-damaged ID card next to Daniel's journal. She had never dared open the journal since the day he vanished, but now she did. The first page still bore his handwriting, keyhole route, one last try before the first snow. Tucked between the pages were crumpled pay stubs, cash payments signed by Vernon Hartley. The dates lined up exactly with the weeks before Daniel and Miles set out for the mountain. She stared at the clean, deliberate signature. Every line of ink on that paper felt like a chain wrapping tighter around her chest. 3 years, and she had never seen it before. Why hadn't Vernon ever mentioned he'd hired Daniel? Why had he stood there today at the scene, watching, asking, then quietly walking away, as though it had nothing to do with him? The wind howled through the cracks of her cabin, whistling low and long. Emily stayed up late into the night, reading every entry in Daniel's journal. There were notes about long evenings, mending fences at the Hartley Ranch, mentions of Vernon's advice about a shortcut through private land, casual observations that now sounded more like breadcrumbs leading into a trap. When she finally closed the journal and pressed the pay stubs flat against the table, the thought was clear as the mountain wind outside. She had to know. She had to look him in the eyes. The next morning, fog still clung thick over the town and the base of Long's Peak, turning the world into a white haze. Emily woke earlier than usual, brewed a quick cup of coffee, and stood before the mirror, telling herself to stay calm. The pay stubs were tucked neatly in her jacket pocket. Down at the edge of the park where the mountain foothills gave way to pasture lay Hartley Ranch, a name that had burned in her mind all through the night. The road to the ranch wound through dew-soaked golden hills, opening at last to a wide expanse of neatly fenced fields. A polished metal sign between two stone pillars read Hartley Ranch, since 1963. A gravel driveway stretched across open pastures where herds of cattle grazed lazily beneath the weak sun. At its center stood a grand wooden house on a rise, commanding a view of the valley and the peaks beyond. Emily pulled over, stepped out, and inhaled the sharp morning air before climbing the porch steps. The heavy wooden door loomed before her, quiet and polished. She pressed the doorbell, listening to its chime echo through the house. No answer. She knocked harder this time, then paused. Still silence. Circling around the back, she crossed a porch lined with wilted flower pots and caught sight of a carefully tended garden. Everything was neat, orderly, nothing out of place. Yet that perfection sent a chill through her. Farther down, beyond a slope of pine, she noticed a low structure nestled into the hillside, a bunker of weathered concrete, its thick walls half hidden among the trees. Vent pipes jutted upward, like sentinels. It didn't belong in this picturesque ranch setting. Emily hesitated a moment, then slowly followed the dirt track leading to it. Gravel crunched underfoot loud in the silence. Beside the steel door, a security camera blinked red. Fresh tire tracks cut through the soft earth, stopping at the door. She stood there staring at it, feeling her heartbeat climb. Then a faint sound reached her ears, muffled but distinct somewhere inside. Metal scraped against concrete, like chains dragging. Emily took a step back, her eyes locked on the lifeless door, a sense of something heavy and watchful pressing down on her. She didn't see Vernon Hartley anywhere, but his presence seemed to fill the place, as though each brick, each shadow, carried his imprint. Retreating to her car, she turned the key, though her hands trembled. The words in Daniel's journal ran through her mind, late nights fixing fences at Hartley's Vernon's shortcut to the mountain, his promises. All of it lined up like breadcrumbs leading into the dark. She gripped the steering wheel and cast one last look toward the bunker door, as though trying to pierce through it. Something down there she knew was waiting. Something she was getting closer to. The cold wind swept through the valley, carrying the dry scent of hay and earth. Emily drove away slowly, but the image of that gray door with its faint red glow stayed burned into her mind like an unhealed wound. That night she sat at her kitchen table, under the weak yellow light the pay stubs spread before her. She knew no one would believe just her word. She knew, too, that if she hesitated, Daniel would remain nothing more than a face on a missing poster in the post office window. She needed a plan. And as the clock crept past midnight, her eyes hardened like the granite peaks outside. That night, the wind howled through the eaves of Estespark, whipping dry leaves into spirals above the dark streets. Emily sat motionless at her kitchen table, the old infrared trail camera, and Daniel's battered carrying strap laid out in front of her. The weak light from the lamp carved deep hollows into her face, sleepless and determined. She'd thought it through all afternoon. If all she had were feelings, hunches, faint hints, no one would believe her. The sheriff would just shake his head, mumbling about privacy and no grounds, while her brother rotted in the dark. If she wanted to save Daniel, she'd have to make her own evidence. The clock crept past 2 a.m. when Emily finally rose, zipped up her jacket, tied her hair back tight, and slung the camera over her shoulder. The road to Hartley Ranch was deserted, streetlights casting dim yellow pools in the fog. She killed her headlights and let the blackness swallow the car tires, crunching faintly over the gravel like whispers. She pulled off into a stand of pines 100 yards from the ranch. Below her, the concrete bunker still crouched in the earth, dark and silent. A single red light blinked faintly from the security camera like an unblinking eye. Emily stepped lightly over the carpet of pine needles, keeping low, every nerve alive with the sound of her own heartbeat. She chose a thick tree about 30 feet from the door, its bark hollowed just enough to shield the lens. Slowly, methodically, she strapped the camera in place, tightened the cord, and angled it toward the door. The little green indicator blinked, armed and ready. As she crouched to make one last adjustment, a faint sound behind her froze her blood. A dim beam of light cut through the trees, harsh and cold. She turned, her breath catching. 10 paces away stood a tall figure, broad-shouldered, his white hair gleaming faintly under the moonlight. Vernon Hartley. He didn't speak. He simply watched her, calm and silent, his presence filling the space like a shadow waiting to swallow her. She barely managed to rise when his hand shot forward, gripping her shoulder and yanking her off balance. She fell hard onto the ground, her cheek scraping against dead branches, the smell of earth filling her lungs. Vernon knelt, his grip vice like his other hand, pulling a plastic zip tie from his pocket, practiced and sure. Emily fought, clawing at his hands, but his strength was overwhelming his arms, corded with decades of ranch work. The plastic bit into her wrists, cutting off blood flow, cold and merciless. He leaned close, his breath hot against her ear, voice low and measured. "You shouldn't have come back here." Then everything blurred. He dragged her across the gravel, down the concrete stairs. Each step thudded into her back, and the smell hit her damp, metallic stale. The bunker swallowed her whole, lit by a faint, sickly green fluorescent glow. The space was wider than she expected, shelves, lined with canned goods, bottles of water, like a doomsday stockpile. But in the far corner on a narrow cot was a shape. A body skeletal draped in filthy cloth hair, long and matted over his hollow face. His ankle was shackled to a steel ring sunk into the floor. He didn't even lift his head when they entered his eyes, empty, unfocused. But Emily knew him at once, Daniel. Her knees nearly gave out. His gaze drifted up slowly, a flicker of recognition, but no words came. His eyes stayed fixed on her weak faint, like a dying ember. Behind her, Vernon's hand settled on her shoulder, heavy as a stone. His voice cut through the silence, calm and deliberate. "You'll stay. Now. You know." Emily didn't answer. She just stared at her brother, at the way he'd been broken and left in the dark. But inside her, a spark caught fire, and she swore, even as the darkness closed in, that she would not die here. The air in the bunker was thick, heavy with dampness, and the metallic stench of rust and unwashed flesh. The sickly green fluorescent light spilled across the concrete floor like the pallor of a corpse. Emily sank to her knees, eyes fixed on Daniel's wasted face. He lay motionless, his gaze hollow, but his fingers twitched faintly, as though some part of him still recognized her. A chill ran through her. Her throat tightened, her hands clenched hard against the concrete until her knuckles split. 3 years. For 3 long years her brother had been kept here, stripped of light, of freedom, of everything that made him human. Vernon loomed behind her, his shadow stretching across the wall like a nightmare come alive. He said nothing, at first, just crouched, unhooked another length of chain from the rack, and slowly approached. The steel cuff closed around Emily's ankle with a dry, decisive click, cold and biting. His hands were steady, strong, despite their age, each motion methodical, like he was tethering livestock to a post. Emily didn't cry out. She only stared up at him, her eyes burning in the dark. Vernon checked the lock, stepped back, and spared a glance at Daniel. For a fleeting second his gaze softened, like a grotesque kind of tenderness, as if he still believed what he'd done was care. He turned away, moving to the shelves, pulling down medicine bottles, protein powders, canned food. His movements were deliberate, ritualistic, repeated so many times they'd become second nature. Emily watched him, silently, eyes darting to each corner of the room, measuring the distance to the door, to the stairs, to the shelves. She memorized the way his fingers turned the lock, the way the door handle gleamed, the exact sound of the bolt. Inside, her fear had hardened into something else. Fury sharpened by hope, raw and hot, like a small flame catching in dry timber. Vernon mixed something into a plastic cup, stirred, and set it on the table beside Daniel. He leaned down, voice low, and measured, "Don't fight. Drink. It'll all feel easier." Daniel turned his face away, lips pressed into a thin line. Vernon sighed, straightened, and let his eyes fall on Emily, like an unspoken warning. Emily didn't flinch. Her stare burned brighter. The night stretched on. Vernon finally left the steel door groaning shut behind him. The heavy click of the lock echoed through the concrete like a gunshot. Emily sat against the wall, the chill seeping through her bones, but her fists stayed tight. She tilted her head toward her brother, their eyes meeting in the dark. He was frail, diminished, but somewhere in that hollow stare, there was still something left of him, the boy who once scaled the highest peaks with bare hands, the boy who once grinned at the world from snowy summits. And Emily knew. Even if she had to break every link of this chain, even if she had to bleed before dawn, she would get her brother out of here. In the cold, airless bunker, time seemed to grind to a halt. Emily couldn't tell how long it had been since Vernon left, only the faint sound of Daniel's shallow breathing, the occasional rattle of his chain when he shifted. The air reeked of damp concrete and iron. The pale green light from the fluorescents cast sickly shadows over the walls. She sat, curled up against the wall, eyes wide in the dark, mind racing. Her fingers worked quietly, feeling for weakness in the plastic tie around her wrists. Vernon had fastened it tight, but not perfectly. Footsteps above. Metallic clinks the groan of the steel door boots descending the stairs. Emily shut her eyes, inhaled deeply, twisting the tie just slightly harder. The door opened, a bright slice of light cutting into the bunker. Vernon entered, a tray of food in his hands, which he set hard on the table. His eyes swept over Daniel, who still lay silent, then fixed on Emily, sharp and cold. He sat, pulled a folding knife from his pocket, and snapped it open. Slowly, methodically, he began to peel an apple, the blade glinting in the harsh light. Every motion was deliberate, calm, so calm it made her skin crawl. Emily twisted her wrist again, feeling the plastic begin to give. Pain shot through her hands, blood slicking her skin. But she kept pulling, biting down to keep from making a sound. Vernon's eyes flicked toward her, sensing something. He tilted his head, studying her for a long moment, then gave the faintest smirk, as if amused, and stood. He gathered the tray and moved toward the door boots, echoing. The lock clicked, and the door shut behind him. That was the moment. Emily yanked hard. The tie snapped with a dry pop, her wrists swelling and raw. Breathing fast, she crouched low, working her fingers to coax the blood back. Her eyes darted to the chain at her ankle. She scanned the room, searching for anything sharp. On the table, Vernon's knife still lay there gleaming. She crawled forward slowly, careful to keep the chain from rattling too loud. She wrapped her bloody fingers around the knife, its weight steady and cold in her grip. Daniel stirred faintly, watching her, and in his hollow eyes, for the first time, she saw a flicker of light. Emily wedged the blade into the padlock at her ankle, twisting hard. A loud, decisive click. The shackle fell away, clattering on the floor. She stood, her legs trembling but her heart roaring. Crossing the room, she knelt by Daniel, cutting through the filthy straps holding him. His wrists fell limp into her hands. His lips moved silent, but his eyes met hers. She laid a hand on his shoulder, whispering, "We're leaving." Footsteps on the stairs. Vernon was coming back. Emily snatched up the knife and stepped in front of her brother's shoulders, squared eyes blazing like fire. This time, she was ready. The heavy footsteps on the stairs pounded louder, with each second echoing through the bunker like a second heartbeat. Emily tightened her grip on the knife, the blood from her raw wrists making the steel slick and cold in her palm. The bunker door slammed open, harsh white light spilling down the concrete steps. Vernon descended, shoulders hunched beneath the weight of a heavy canvas bag, which he threw to the floor with a dull thud. He froze when he saw her standing unchained, barefoot, the knife raised as she shielded Daniel. His face darkened. Vernon began to walk toward her, each step deliberate, his eyes burning like hot iron. The sound of his boots striking concrete filled the silence, mingling with Emily's ragged breaths. She didn't move back. Vernon's hand slipped to his belt, and he drew a pistol, black and heavy, glinting in the cold light. He raised it to hip level, and though his voice was low and calm, the threat was clear. Emily saw his finger tighten on the trigger. She knew if he took one more step, everything would end. But she lunged first. Her strike was fiercer than she imagined. The blade buried deep in his upper arm, hot blood sprang across her hand. Vernon roared in pain, stumbling back, the gun clattering to the concrete. Emily dove for it, her hands trembling as she wrapped her fingers around the grip. Vernon was already on her, his massive hand closing around her throat, pinning her against the wall. His breath was hot and metallic, smelling of iron and gun oil. She didn't feel fear anymore, only heat. Her finger tightened on the trigger. The gunshot cracked like thunder rattling the walls. Vernon froze, his eyes wide in shock. Slowly, his legs buckled, and he crashed to the floor with a heavy, lifeless thud. His body jerked once, then stilled completely. Emily stood over him, shaking her ears, ringing from the blast. The bunker fell silent again, save for the faint rattle of Daniel's chain as he stirred weakly, raising his head to look at her. She knelt and pried the keys from Vernon's pocket, trying each one until the lock on Daniel's shackle popped open. He slumped forward into her arms, reeking of sweat and dust, but she held him close, feeling his thin, trembling arms wrap around her. Somewhere above the wail of sirens pierced the night. Blue and red lights swept through the ventilation shaft, flickering across the concrete walls. At last, someone had called for help. Emily rose to her feet, pulling Daniel up with her. Pain and determination mingled in her eyes as she gripped his filthy hand tight. No matter how heavy these doors felt, tonight they would open, and they would walk into the light. When Emily and Daniel emerged from the bunker, the icy night air hit their faces like shards of glass. The sirens were close now, red and blue lights swirling, cutting across the slope's wild grass. Powerful flashlights swept over the open steel door, and the sound of boots crunching gravel thundered closer, weapons at the ready. She couldn't even lift her arms to signal, only stumbled forward, her legs trembling beneath her. A young deputy rushed to take Daniel from her, shouting for medics. Voices barked orders, radios crackled, and the ranch was swarmed. The white fence at the front had already been torn open, and an ambulance idled just beyond its back doors, open amber lights flashing in the dark. They laid Daniel on a stretcher, wrapping a thin blanket around his frail frame. His half-closed eyes found her for a moment, then drifted shut again. Emily held his hand until a paramedic gently touched her shoulder, telling her they needed to take him. She let go her swollen, bloodied fingers, finally relaxing. Sheriff Kessler appeared behind her, his face a grim, muted apology. He stood there staring into the bunker before glancing at Emily. Slowly, deliberately, he nodded. No words were necessary. His eyes said it all. I should have believed you. Officers and crime scene techs poured into the bunker, floodlights cutting through the darkness. The metallic rattle of chains, the scribble of pens on notepads, the relentless clicks of cameras filled the night. Emily stood still, watching the once locked door gape open like a raw wound on the mountainside, exposing everything it had hidden. After that, everything blurred. The ambulance sped off into the night with Daniel inside. Emily rode in the back of a patrol car, wrapped in a blanket, her fingers still sticky with dried blood. At the hospital, Daniel was wheeled into the emergency room, the red light above the door glowing bright. Emily sat alone on the cold plastic bench in the hallway, staring at the floor, her mind hollow. She felt like she was breaking apart, her body heavy and numb, but her hand still trembled faintly, clinging to the edge of the blanket. A while later, the door swung open. A young doctor stepped out, pulling off her gloves, and nodded gently at Emily. Daniel was alive. Emily collapsed forward, covering her face as tears streamed down. The next morning, all of Estespark reeled from the news. Headlines screamed, "Prominent rancher arrested for kidnapping, murder and unlawful imprisonment." Vernon's face flashed across television screens, being led to a squad car in handcuffs. His features gaunt, but his eyes still defiant, as though he were the one wronged. At a brief press conference, Sheriff Kessler confirmed that evidence recovered at the ranch was enough to charge Vernon with Miles Hatcher's murder and 3 years of unlawful captivity of Daniel Bauer. Further searches uncovered records, objects, and DNA evidence indicating he had assaulted other young men over 2 decades. Emily didn't stay to watch the rest. She sat by Daniel's bedside, her hand wrapped around his. He slept, but his fingers curled weakly around hers, clinging to the only safe shore he had left in the storm, because she knew the storm was far from over. The sky over Estes Park was overcast on that winter morning. Snow fell light and cold, like salt on an open wound. The streets were quiet, the pines dusted white, and the Rockies loomed muted in the distance. Long's Peak hidden behind a shroud of gray clouds. Emily stepped out of the hospital, her frozen hands clasped tightly together as she breathed in the sharp mountain air still tinged with the faint scent of antiseptic. Behind the glass doors, Daniel slept in his bed, frail but alive, his breathing steadier now. The doctors said it would take time, long months, perhaps years, for his body and mind to heal. Vernon Hartley had been formally charged first-degree murder, kidnapping, sexual assault, unlawful imprisonment, resisting arrest. The press called him the Mountain Devil, once a pillar of the community, now the embodiment of deception and sickness. In his interrogation, he confessed to everything, detail by detail, calm, even proud, as if recounting some personal triumph. Emily didn't care. She didn't read the papers, didn't watch the news. She didn't want to hear his name ever again. All that mattered was that Daniel was alive. That afternoon, she returned to his room. He was awake, though his eyes were still clouded dim. The nurse gently adjusted his blanket, gave Emily a small smile, and left them alone in silence. Emily sat by the bed, her hand finding his. He turned his head weakly, his cracked lips barely moving. His voice was rough and hollow, like wind scraping through the peaks. "Miles, Emily lowered her head, tears stinging her eyes as she squeezed his hand. "He tried to save you, but he didn't make it." Daniel's eyes closed, a single tear sliding down his sunken cheek, but his hand didn't let go of hers. His thin fingers still clung to her like the last piton, holding him against the cliff. The next day, Emily helped him sit up for the first time in 3 years. He was too weak to stand, but as the wheelchair rolled down the hallway and the hospital doors opened to the snowy air, his eyes blinked, adjusting to the daylight. He looked up at Long's Peak, the place where everything began. Emily placed a hand on his shoulder, firm, quiet. "You don't have to go back there." He didn't answer, just took a deep breath, closing his eyes as his fingers gripped hers. The bunker was sealed now. Hartley Ranch abandoned its paths, overgrown chains rusting against cracked walls. Sometimes, townsfolk would stop at the gate, glance and shiver, and turn away. But Emily knew the darkness would linger there for a long time, yet hiding in the cracks of every ridge, every forest, every gust of wind that howled through the peaks. It didn't disappear. It only waited for the next weak soul. She stood beside Daniel in the snow, the two of them leaning into each other, watching the white-capped mountains. And for the first time in 3 years, Emily thought we survived. The darkness lay behind them now. And ahead, at least, there was still light.